Hello and welcome again to this is our 14th podcast as we are continuing into Second Kings and then into First Chronicles as we finish on this one. And in this today in this situation we continue as we talked about a little bit in the last time. We got a little bit of ahead, but we saw we in this today's reading we talked with Hezekiah beginning, and Hezekiah was one of the good kings. In fact, they said he even reigned longer, one of the longer terms. He reigned 29 years, but he was one who became ill, and but in this sense, his eyes were good. I mean, his timing was good. Things were going good for him, but then he got word that he was sick and he wasn't going to recover from it, and so. He goes around and he goes into mourning, into sense, and but in this time frame, Isaiah comes to him and encourages him, and he says to prepare a bandage made of figs. So they did so. They put it on his swelling, and he started to get better. So he was beginning to do things, but it took a little bit. He mourned. I mean, he really mourned. He cried out to God. And God heard that mourning and that crying and told him that he wouldn't die then, but he would add 15 years to his life. In this instance, even Isaiah says, "This will be your sign from the Lord that you will make his promise come true. Should the shadow go forward, 10 steps are back." As Pastor Tom and I were talking a little bit earlier, it's interesting because it's literally a sun going back. You know, it's just doing things that we're not used to things doing, but at this time it was a good sign for Hezekiah, because he knew he still had time to do some things, to continue to move on.
It's interesting to me how many of the kings, when they are told your time will be fine, but your children and grandchildren are going to suffer, how many times the kings say, "Oh, okay," as if that's not my problem.
Yeah.
And for us, most of us as parents, if we heard from God, either you will have trouble or your children will have trouble, most of us would say, "Well, give it to me. Give it to me. Make it during my time. Make them have, let them have the good times." But the kings don't. The challenge that Judah was facing was different than the challenge that Israel faced. Israel's invading army came from the north, from Assyria, and the army that was challenging Judah came from the east, from Babylon, from modern day Iraq, if you will, and was continuing to try and invade. The first attempt was during Hezekiah's reign. They didn't succeed. Hezekiah sent them back, but Babylon kept trying time and again.
Yep. And eventually, I mean, they get to that point because, as in fact, even within this time of Hezekiah and into the Manasseh, by Manasseh's time, they begin to fall. The fall of Samaria or Israel goes to Assyria, and you begin to see that the captive of the northern side, of Israel being held and doing things, just being taken captive, and you begin to see and fear this as it goes. And then it continues. You go through, because there's a lot of kings that happen through with Israel, and like you said, not one of them did a good thing on Israel. But and that's part of the punishment that God was. He was just so fed up that it was just that time was like, well, I'm just gonna exile them and get let them pay, basically, kind of, I don't hate to say let them pay, but it was basically a punishment that they were receiving because they had not been worshiping him and doing things that had been going against him. And so they get captive and end up taken into exile.
The text that we have in the scriptures was written down from the perspective of that exile in Babylon. Not the northern tribes in Assyria, but the southern tribes in Babylon. And they were looking back, I think, largely to try and understand, how did we get here? What does this mean? Why? What do we do now? And that, I think that colors the way they look back to see that first sin of Jeroboam and the two golden calves that we talked about last time, and that the northern kingdom never overcame that. The southern kingdom had some good times and some bad times. In the end, there was more bad, and they too were taken captive. We talked a little bit last time, mistakenly, jumping ahead, talked a little bit about the reforms of Josiah. Josiah came as Hezekiah's great-grandson, the third king after Hezekiah. And during Josiah's reign, one of the priests finds the book of the law in the temple, traditionally thought to be the book of Deuteronomy. Josiah asks for it to be read. They read the whole book to Josiah, and he stands and rips his clothes, a sign of grief in the people of Israel, even today. And Josiah begins the profound reformation to try and draw things back, to try and help the people come back to faith. They celebrate Passover for the first time in many, many years. They begin to rebuild the temple. They redistribute the wealth. They do all of the things that should be a part of the people of faith. Unfortunately, Josiah dies, and with him the reform dies.
It sure does. I mean, everything that he did, it's like all the work that he did to get everything straight went right out the window, so to speak, when the next one comes in, because once after Josiah and the next ones that come in, I mean, they do everything that basically putting things back to where they were. In fact, the Pharaoh who killed Josiah is the one who says that he's going to be anointing him as the next thing. So he's not only now as you're doing this, but you're also ruling under a Pharaoh as kind of his prisoner, so to speak. So you're in this continuum. You're trying to do
Egypt.
things. Yeah, but you're learning to this, and I can't imagine what they were thinking of this. But as we say, this Jehoaz, however you want to say it, that he was appointed, he was only king for 3 months. And so very, very short amount of time, not the shortest, but a very short amount of time that he ruled before he then takes Pharaoh and again puts the next king. And even in some, he changes names. So like one who was, however you say, I think it was Eliakim or Eliakim was actually his name. Josiah, or the Pharaoh changes it to Jehoiakim, and so.
Yeah, I've never gotten Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim
I know,
straightened around in my mind.
No,
I changed
so
one
close.
letter and one letter, and we're supposed to be able to notice that. Yeah, I'm not real good at that.
No. But that's what, just Jehoiakim, he submitted eventually he submits to King Nebuchadnezzar, in a sense, because this is the king of Babylon. He attacks them. They come into battle now, and they're now into battle with King Nebuchadnezzar, and being past some of them even exiled to Babylon in these senses. And so as they're going through, I mean, it says, in fact, it says that the Egyptian king never left his country again because the Babylon king had taken over the whole territory that had previously belonged to him. And so he really had no place to go except to submit to Nebuchadnezzar, since that battle was going on now, and to be taken into exile.
Some years ago, when we were in Germany, we went to a museum in Germany. Cannot remember the name of the museum, but the museum has the Gate of Babylon. It was taken, in the early part of the 20th century. Archaeologists very carefully took artifacts from where they belonged back to Europe. So it was brought stone by stone back into this museum and rebuilt. And it is this massive, if you pardon me for describing it this way, Duke blue tile, just brilliant blue. And I've often thought about those captives. And it was, the gate was built, the city was built out of this blue stone, so that as you came up to it, the sun just gleamed off of it, and you were totally overcome by the image of power. And that was what happened to the people of Israel, or Judah, I guess, more accurately, as they returned as they were taken. Captive into Babylon. In Psalm 137, it says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" That experience fundamentally changed the people of faith as they were taken into captivity in this way. The 10 northern tribes taken into Assyria, seeming to have never reassembled. The 2 southern tribes taken to Babylon to stay for 7 years. And the people of faith were fundamentally changed by that.
Yeah. And even in these sense, when Jehoiakim, I guess it's after Jehoiakim, him and his all decide to surrender to them. That Nebuchadnezzar claims to make other people kings. Some of them stay faithful to him, some of them don't, some of them rebel against him, and then others continue. But in the sense, as we get to the end of 2 Kings, Jehoiakim is actually, it says in here, Nebuchadnezzar's no longer there. This new, however you say his name, I don't know, Awil Merodach or something like that.
Sure,
sure. But he speaks kindly to Jehoiakim, and on the he brings him, he seats him above, and he eats with him for the rest of his life. He says he gets a regular food allowance given to him every day for the rest of his life. So while he doesn't become the head again, he does end up in a good relationship with the next king that I was taken, the Babylonian king.
And at that point, we start the story all the way back over again. I shared with Pastor Dan that I'm reading the Old Testament in the Tanakh ordering, which puts a big long time between reading Second Kings and starting First Chronicles, which has been helpful for me because it does feel like you're just starting this story back over again. We start this time all the way back at Adam and begin to list child after child after child, and counting our way person by person until we finally get to David and Saul and the beginnings of the story. The first 9 chapters mostly are genealogy, which can be hard to read.
Yes, it was hard. It was hard to read. It was hard to read. But yeah. So, and when we get to chapter 9, in this section, we start reading of how Jerusalem is restored in this sense. I mean, this is like Judah was carried into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness, but then there's people. But they're also the first to resettle their property in towns, because this is way back.
This is way back. This first is settlement. This is not the return from Babylon.
Right,
this is the getting out of Egypt.
Yes, it's been
time.
A long time. Yes, way back when it come out, and as they're going through here, you see each one going through, and you read about Saul coming in a little bit. You read more about, not as much about Saul. You read about his family. But you do hear about the battle that he faced with the Philistines and how he died and how Jonathan and the sons died. And this one did list something a little different. This one did not say they burnt the corpses this time. It just says that they went and picked them up and buried their bones and the things. So that was a little different because I looked for that because I remember reading it in the last one. This one doesn't say they did that. But the big thing, it says... in verse 10, verse 13, it says, Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord and hadn't followed the Lord's word. And it talks about him even consulting the median for guidance. He never consulted God. And then how he was calling Samuel up. And so, in his sense, that's the kingdom then went to David.
Right.
And like I said, we go through these. You go through this now as you're going through here, and Israel makes David king, and David begins, and you read about all his warriors, which we have gone through. You read about the army. You read about David's first time trying to move the Ark of the Covenant, and one of the servants, I guess I don't know how you say Uzzah, whatever. There's a stumble and he reaches out to touch it, and because he touches the ark, he dies, and David gets mad at God for that. But then they decide he's not going to move it anymore, so they give it to. In this time, it says Obadiah. I think it was Obadiah in a previous one, but in Obed, if you want to say, in simple, his household begins to flourish in the sense he's being blessed as the ark is in his house. But then they begin to move it, and his kingship goes on.
The thing that struck me about that story is that in the first attempt to move the ark, they put it on an ox cart. In the second time, they bring the Levites and the poles, and they carry the ark the way God intended.
Yes.
And he
learned his lesson.
I hadn't noticed that before. I have an odd interest in the idea of the Ark of the Covenant. I've watched an awful lot of the History Channel, Discovery Channel stories about what was the ark, where is the ark, all of those things. And, those of you that have heard me say, I happen to subscribe to the theory that the ark still exists and that it's in Axum in Ethiopia. And that's one of the reasons I really, really want to go to Ethiopia.
Very cool.
So,
but yes, like I said, as we see this, he finally does get the ark to where it needs to be because he followed the way that God intended it to be carried. And as they get there, he does his worship and his dancing and everything that they've done before. We read God's promise again to David of the promise that his throne will live forever, and that that'll always continue. And I think we talked about last time. I think you touched on David's prayer of what he prayed for here, and how you can see the thanksgiving in this prayer of how significant it is for him, and the thankfulness that he has.
Actually, that was Tim in our staff meeting that touched on
was it?
that.
Okay, sorry. I remember us going through. Okay.
Yeah, so for those of you that are listening, our staff is using the readings of the year of the Bible for our weekly devotions when we get together. And this past week, Tim Messina shared about the prayer of David and called us all to reflect on how we would write a prayer for this. Very, very meaningful, meaningful time.
Yeah.
We end this week just before Solomon builds the temple, and we will look to coming back and working our way through the remainder of Chronicles.
Yes. Well, thank you all for joining us again, and we look forward to seeing back with you again next week.